The sun has barely cleared the horizon, and a merchant captain is already gripping the rail. Something is out there, low on the water, moving fast. He squints through the salt haze. The shape is small, 2 masts, a hull that sits almost flat against the sea, and it is closing the distance between them like a dog chasing a rabbit across an open field. This is the Corvette, and by the time most captains recognised what they were looking at, there was very little left to do. Picture a ship about the length of 2 school buses parked end to end. Where a warship of the period sat heavy and tall like a floating fortress, the Corvette was lean and low and hungry looking. It carried somewhere between 10 and 28 cannons arranged along its sides, enough firepower to tear the deck off a merchant ship in a single pass. But the cannons were almost secondary. The Corvette's real weapon was speed. Most cargo ships of the 16 and 1700s moved through the ocean the way a loaded shopping cart moves through a parking lot. Slow, predictable, heavy with goods. A Corvette could outrun almost anything that merchants put to sea. In a good wind, it pulled away from its targets the way a sports car pulls away from a truck on a highway. And in lighter winds, its shallow hull and small size let it use angles and currents that bigger ships could never touch. The design was not an accident. Shipbuilders across France, the Barbary coast of North Africa, and the Dutch Republic had spent decades refining what a fast-fighting ship should look like. The result was a vessel that could chase, close, threaten, and destroy before a merchant crew had time to think through their options. And Corvette captains knew exactly how to use that psychological edge. Imagine you are a sailor on a cargo ship 3 weeks out of Lisbon. You are tired. The food has been bad for days. The water tastes like wood. And now, off the port side, a small fast ship is running up your flank without flying any flag at all. Do you run? You are already slower. Do you fight? Your ship carries 6 small cannons and a crew of 14. Do you pray? Honestly, that is where most merchant sailors ended up. The Corvette did not just win fights, it won them before they started. The sight of that low, fast hull was often enough. Crews surrendered, captains handed over their papers, cargo changed hands on the open ocean with barely a shot fired. That was the economy of fear that the Corvette created, and it ran for nearly 200 years across the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, and the North Sea. Historians who have studied the age of sail describe the Corvette as the perfect predator of its era. Fast enough to catch, small enough to hide, armed enough to destroy, and cheap enough that even a mid-level pirate captain or a cash-strapped king could afford to put one to sea. The merchant captain at the rail right now is watching that shape get bigger. He is about to find out just how fast a Corvette really moves, and what the crew on the other end of this chase actually wanted from him. The answer to that question was far more complicated than most people expect. Somewhere along the docks of a French port city in the mid-1600s, a master shipbuilder is walking the frame of a new vessel with a piece of chalk in his hand. He's not building a warship. He's building something lighter, something that will bend to the wind rather than fight it. The Corvette did not appear out of nowhere. It grew out of a long argument about what a fighting ship should actually be. For most of the 15 and 1600s, European navies were obsessed with size. Bigger ships, more cannons, taller masts. The idea was simple. More power meant more control of the sea. But size had a cost that nobody liked to talk about. Big ships were slow. They needed large crews to sail them. They ran aground in shallow water, and they cost fortunes to build and maintain. A king could bankrupt his treasury fitting out a fleet of heavy warships, and then watch them sit in port for 3 months, waiting for the right wind. The Corvette came from a different school of thought. Build it light, build it fast, give it enough guns to threaten anything it could catch. Then let the captain's nerve do the rest. The French were early masters of this design. Their shipyards along the Atlantic coast produced corvettes that were both fast and seaworthy, able to handle the rough Atlantic swells without coming apart. The Dutch had their own versions. The Barbary corsairs of North Africa developed something similar almost independently, shaped by the narrow straits and variable winds of the Mediterranean. What all of these builders were chasing was the same thing: a hull that moved through water the way a hand moves through air. Smooth, easy, without resistance. The key was in the lines of the hull, the underwater shape that determined everything about how a ship performed. A heavy warship had a broad, deep hull that held its position in rough seas but dragged badly in anything less than a strong wind. The Corvette's hull was shallower and narrower, designed to lift slightly with speed rather than plough through the water. Imagine dragging a brick through a bathtub versus dragging a knife blade through it. That is the difference. Shipbuilders also kept the Corvette's rigging simple. 2 masts were standard. The sails were large relative to the ship's size, which meant the Corvette caught wind that other ships barely felt. In a gentle breeze that left a frigate drifting, a well-rigged Corvette was already moving. Captains who sailed them described the sensation as almost alive. The ship responded to the wind the way a good horse responds to a rider: quick, sensitive, eager to run. This mattered enormously in the realities of a sea chase. Merchant ships tried to run, naval escorts tried to intercept, and the Corvette captain, if he knew his ship, could calculate angles and wind shifts that turned a long chase into a short one. The builders also kept costs down deliberately. A Corvette could be constructed and fitted out for a fraction of what a frigate cost. That meant more of them on the water. It meant that private operators, not just national navies, could afford to own and sail them, and that is the detail that changed everything. Once the Corvette became affordable, it became accessible to a whole world of captains who answered to no king at all. What those captains did with them is a story that ran for generations, and it started in a way that most people would never expect. Step down through the hatch and let your eyes adjust. The first thing you notice is the smell: salt, wet wood, sweat, something animal underneath all of it that never quite leaves a ship, no matter how long it has been at sea. The beams above your head are close. A tall man has to duck, or he learns to duck after hitting his head once or twice. The floor beneath your feet is damp and moves in a slow, rolling way that your body either learns to accept or never does. This is home for a Corvette crew of somewhere between 50 and 100 men, for weeks at a time. The sleeping arrangements on a working Corvette were what historians politely call functional. Hammocks hung in rows so tight that a man's shoulder almost touched his neighbour's when they slept. Each hammock was about 14 inches wide, roughly the width of a school desk. Men slept in shifts. When one watch went up on deck, the other came down and took the still warm hammocks they had just left. There was almost no private space. Your belongings fit in a small chest if you had one, or in a canvas bag tucked at the end of your hammock. Clothing did not dry properly in a ship this size because damp air settled into every corner. Most sailors wore the same clothes for days. Washing happened when it rained and you could stand on deck with a cloth. Food on a long voyage was its own kind of war. The standard diet for a Corvette sailor in the 16 and 1700s centred on hard biscuit, which was a dense, dry cracker that kept for months but often arrived full of weevils. Sailors had a method for this. They would tap the biscuit on the table before eating to knock the insects out. If you were on a Barbary corsair vessel operating out of North Africa, your provisions might include dried dates, olive oil, and occasionally fresh grain. French naval corvettes carried salted pork and dried peas. Neither option inspired joy. Water was stored in wooden barrels and went stale within weeks. Sailors drank it anyway. On longer voyages, captains rationed it carefully because running short of water was more dangerous than running short of almost anything else, and yet men signed up for this. Thousands of them. Every year. Some came for pay. A successful raid on a merchant ship meant a share of the prize, and a good year could earn a sailor more than a farm labourer made in 3 years on land. Some came because life on shore was already desperate. Poverty, debt, legal trouble, or simple boredom drove men to the docks looking for a berth. Some came because they had heard stories. The Corvette had a reputation, speed, action, the thrill of a chase on open water with the wind filling the sails and the whole horizon ahead of you. For a young man with nothing tying him to a specific village or trade, that kind of life had a pull that is not hard to understand. Below deck, though, the romance faded quickly. The sounds at night were the creaking of the hull, the drip of water, the breathing of 50 men in too small a space. On a rough night the whole ship groaned and heaved. Men were sick, men argued, men played cards for stakes they could not afford to lose, and somewhere up above them, in the captain's small cabin at the stern, decisions were being made about where to go next. Those decisions would change everything for everyone on board. The cry came from the man at the top of the mast. One word: sail. And everything on the Corvette changed in an instant. A Corvette battle crew had one job when that word came down from the lookout: get the guns ready before the target knew what was coming. Speed above deck mattered just as much as speed through the water. The fastest Corvette gun crews in the 1700s could have their cannons loaded, primed, and pointed in under 4 minutes. That was not a boast. It was a survival skill. Here is what those 4 minutes looked like. The gun captain, the man responsible for each cannon, grabbed his crew the moment the order rang out. Every gun on a Corvette had a team of between 4 and 6 men working it. They moved in a pattern so practiced that it looked choreographed, because it was. They had drilled it hundreds of times in harbour, in calm weather, in darkness. The muscle memory was the point. First, the cannon was run back from the gun port on a wooden carriage that sat on small wooden wheels. Running it back gave the crew room to load it. The barrel was hot after firing and could be dangerous to touch directly, so loaders used long wooden tools to handle everything inside the barrel. A wet sponge on the end of a long stick went in first. This was called wetting, and it put out any spark still burning inside the barrel from the last shot. If you skipped this step and loaded powder on top of a live spark, the cannon fired while the loader was still standing in front of it. Then came the powder charge. A pre-measured bag of black gunpowder was rammed down the barrel. Then the cannonball itself, a solid iron sphere about the size of a grapefruit for a Corvette's mid-range guns. Then a wad of rope fibre rammed in behind it to hold everything in place. The gun captain used a long metal spike called a priming iron to pierce the powder bag through the touch hole at the top of the barrel. Then a small amount of fine powder went into the touch hole. This was the primer, the small charge that would carry the flame from the lit match down into the main charge and fire the gun. Now the cannon was run back out through the gun port. Ropes on either side of the carriage controlled the angle. The gun captain sighted down the barrel, making small adjustments, waiting. On a Corvette, all of this happened in a space that was roughly the width of a hallway. Men were pressed close together, passing tools, shouting over the wind and the creak of the ship. Smoke from the first broadside turned the gun deck into something close to fog. Eyes stung. Ears rang from the first shots well before the fight was over. The noise of a Corvette broadside at close range was something that sailors who survived it described for the rest of their lives. Not just loud, physical. A pressure wave that hit the chest like a shove. The ship itself lurched sideways with the force of all its guns firing at once. On the receiving end, a Corvette broadside at 200 yards could punch through 14 inches of oak planking. It could remove a mast. It could kill every man standing on an open deck. But here is what the best captains knew. The guns were almost a last resort. There was a weapon they used first that cost no powder at all, and it was far more powerful than iron. The ship ahead is flying the colours of a friendly nation. The Corvette captain watches it through his glass and smiles. He knows exactly what flag that is. He also knows it means nothing. The practice of sailing under a false flag was one of the oldest tricks in the Sea Raiders playbook, and Corvette captains turned it into an art form. The rules of naval engagement in the 16 and 1700s technically required a captain to show his true colours before opening fire. In practice, that rule got bent in every direction imaginable. A corvette hunting in the English Channel might fly Dutch colours when approaching a French vessel. The same ship, hours later, might run up Spanish colours when a Portuguese merchant came into view. Some captains kept a whole wardrobe of flags below deck, sorted by which waters they were sailing, and which nationalities were currently at war with which others. The psychology behind it was razor sharp. A merchant captain who saw an unfamiliar ship on the horizon had to make a fast decision. Run and risk a chase that the corvette would probably win. Or hold course, hope the approaching ship was friendly, and find out when it was close enough to talk. Corvette captains counted on that hesitation. Every minute a merchant captain spent deciding was another minute the corvette spent closing the gap. By the time the merchant crew recognised the deception, the corvette was already inside cannon range. Some captains played the game even further. They would approach flying the flag of a country that the merchant vessel might actually want to see. A ship in distress, perhaps, or a naval escort that happened to be passing. They might even hail the merchant in a friendly way, asking routine questions about destination and cargo, all while their gun crews were quietly running out the cannons below the rail. There was a moment in every one of these encounters when the corvette captain had to choose: strike the false flag, run up the real one, and fire. Experienced captains timed this to the second. Too early, and the merchant had time to react, to turn, to put distance between them. Too late, and the ship was so close that the boarding would be messy and dangerous. The ideal moment was when the corvette was alongside, close enough that the merchant crew could look directly into the faces of the men at the rail. At that range, most merchants had already made their decision. The Barbary corsairs of North Africa were particularly skilled at this approach. Their captains operated across the western Mediterranean and well into the Atlantic, sometimes flying the colours of Christian European nations while closing on other Christian ships. The deception added an extra layer of confusion because it was so brazen. European naval authorities complained constantly about the practice. They passed rules and issued warnings and sent patrol ships to enforce cleaner standards. It barely mattered. The captains who used false colours were moving faster than any enforcement network could track. And the flag game had one final twist that historians still debate. Some corvette captains used the real flag of their own nation, betting that the merchant captain would assume a warship would never attack a friendly vessel directly. The boldness of it was its own camouflage. The merchant at the rail, watching a ship approach under familiar colours, feeling the first small relief that this was probably fine. And then the gun ports opened. The merchant captain has 3 choices. He has about 10 minutes to pick one. The corvette is visible now on the port quarter, running hard on a course that will cut him off in less than an hour if the wind holds. His own ship is carrying a full load of cloth, silver and wine bound for a port he is now beginning to wonder if he will ever see. Run, fight, surrender. Each option comes with its own set of consequences, and none of them are clean. Running sounds simple. Turn the ship away from the threat, put the wind at your back, and make for the nearest coast or the open sea, depending on which direction keeps you away from that corvette. But a merchant ship loaded with cargo sits deep in the water. Every ton of goods below the waterline is drag. The corvette, carrying almost nothing but crew and guns, floats light and flies. The math on a running chase almost always favoured the hunter. There were exceptions. If the merchant was already close to a port with harbour defences, A run for the shelter of its guns sometimes worked. If the weather turned suddenly, a squall or a fog bank could swallow a fleeing ship before the Corvette closed the gap. A few merchant captains escaped this way. A few. The ones who gambled on it and lost ended up in a worse position than if they had made a different choice from the start. Fighting was even harder to justify. Most merchant vessels carried a small number of guns for exactly this kind of situation. 6 to 10 cannons was common on a well-equipped cargo ship of the period. The problem was not just the number of guns, but the number of men trained to use them. A merchant crew was built for sailing, not for combat. They handled ropes and cargo and navigation. Gun drill was something they practiced occasionally, not daily. The Corvette crew, by contrast, had done almost nothing else. Their gun teams were faster, smoother, and more coordinated than anything a merchant could put together in the middle of a panic. A merchant captain who chose to fight a Corvette in open water was accepting a duel where the other man had spent years practicing and he had not. Some did it anyway. Some merchant captains were stubborn, or frightened of what capture meant, or simply refused to give up a cargo that represented everything they owned. Records from the period show a handful of successful defences. They also show the wreckage left when the defence failed. Surrender was the third option, and in raw practical terms it was often the most rational. A Corvette captain who accepted a surrender without a fight had reasons to keep the crew alive and relatively unharmed. The ship was the prize. The cargo was the prize. Dead sailors and a burned deck added nothing to the value of either. Some captains were even courteous about it, allowing the merchant crew to keep personal belongings, dropping them at the nearest coast with a small boat. Some captains were not, and the merchant captain standing at his rail right now does not know which kind is on that Corvette coming toward him. He makes his choice. The story of what happened next was one that survivors carried home and repeated for the rest of their lives, and the details of it were darker and stranger than most people ashore ever imagined. Imagine a warship the size of a city block trying to follow a Corvette into a river delta. The warship draws 25 feet of water below the surface. The river channel ahead is 18 feet deep. The math ends the chase right there. The Corvette draws 8 feet. It keeps going. This was one of the most important tactical advantages the Corvette had, and it is one that most people never think about when they picture sea battles. Draft. The depth a ship's hull extends below the waterline determined where you could sail almost as much as the wind did, and a Corvette's shallow draft turned coastlines, river mouths, island channels, and shallow bays into a private hunting ground that larger ships simply could not enter. The geography of the Mediterranean and the Atlantic coast of Europe and North Africa is full of exactly these kinds of spaces. Shallow lagoons behind barrier islands, river deltas where fresh water meets the sea in a tangle of channels, rocky passages between islands where the water drops to 10 or 12 feet, and every ship needs to know its own depth to the inch. Corvette captains learn these places the way a street runner learns the back alleys of a city. They mapped them, memorized them, used them to ambush passing traffic, and then retreat into water, where no pursuing vessel could follow. The Barbary corsairs were masters of this geography. Operating out of ports along the North African coast, their captains knew every inlet and bay from the straits at the western end of the Mediterranean all the way east to the waters off Greece and Turkey. They used this knowledge to raid the coastal villages of Spain, Italy, France, and Portugal, which were all within easy reach of a fast corvette that knew where to hide. European naval forces found the pursuit maddening. A squadron of heavy frigates might chase a corsair corvette for hours, closing the gap on open water, only to watch the smaller vessel turn toward a stretch of coast that showed no obvious harbour. The corvette would slow slightly, pick its line through a channel the frigates could not see from their angle, and vanish into a lagoon or an estuary where the warships could not follow without running aground. By the time the frustrated frigate captain sent a small boat in to investigate, the corvette was long gone. Inland waters presented their own set of opportunities. River mouths were particularly valuable because river traffic, barges and flat-bottomed cargo boats moving goods between ports and interior cities, was almost entirely defenceless. A corvette that could enter a river delta was a corvette that could raid traffic that had never expected to face a sea threat at all. This happened along the Thames in England, along the Seine in France, along the rivers of the Dutch coast. Corvette raiders probed every waterway that their draft allowed, and the merchants and farmers along those riverbanks learned to watch the water with a different kind of attention. There was one more dimension to the shallow water advantage that changed the nature of entire coastlines. Coastal towns built their defences around the threat of deep-draft warships. Harbour forts, sea walls, and gun batteries were positioned to cover the approaches that large vessels had to use. A corvette captain who knew the local geography could sometimes sail inside those defences, through channels the forts were never built to cover, and be in the harbour before the alarm went out. The sea was not just a highway, it was a maze, and the corvette captains knew the maze better than anyone trying to stop them. The next question was who those captains actually were. He is not the pirate you picture. He is not wearing a tricorn hat on a movie poster. He is standing on the quarter-deck of a fast corvette in the cold morning light, calculating wind and current, and the position of a distant sail with the focus of a chess player 3 moves ahead of his opponent. The men who commanded corvettes during the golden age of sea raiding came from a surprisingly wide range of backgrounds. Some were licensed privateers, captains who held official letters from a king or a government that authorized them to attack enemy shipping during wartime. Others were corsairs operating under the loose authority of the Barbary states of North Africa, which functioned as something between a government and a crime organization depending on who you asked. A smaller number were outright pirates who answered to no one. What they shared was an intimate knowledge of their ships and a tolerance for the specific pressures of commanding a small vessel on a long hunt. Jean Bart was perhaps the most famous corvette captain the North Sea ever produced. He was born in 1650 on the coast of what is now Belgium, the son of a fisherman who'd been sailing those waters since he could walk. Jean Bart went to sea as a boy and learned the North Sea the way other children learn the streets of their village. Every sandbar, every current, every trick of the tidal weather. He learned from a Dutch admiral early in his career, then switched sides when France and the Dutch Republic went to war because loyalty in this world was complicated. What made Jean Bart extraordinary was a combination of physical courage and cold-eyed tactical calculation. He did not look for glory. He looked for results. He ran his crews hard and he ran them well, and the men who sailed with him came back alive more often than the men who sailed with captains who prioritized boldness over planning. His record over a 30-year career included the capture of hundreds of merchant vessels and several naval engagements against ships that outgunned him significantly. He became famous enough that the French king personally raised him to nobility, an almost unimaginable social climb for a fisherman's son. On the Barbary coast, the captains were different in origin but not always in method. The corsairs of Algiers, Tunis and Sale operated within a system that was partly religious, partly commercial and entirely practical. Their captains came from all over the Mediterranean world. Some were North African by birth, others were European converts, men who had been captured or who had chosen to cross over, who brought their knowledge of European shipping routes with them. What both the Northern Europeans and the Barbary captains understood was that the corvette was a tool that multiplied a skilled commander's advantages. A great captain on a slow ship was still a slow ship. A great captain on a corvette was something else entirely. The sea was about to show exactly what that meant, and the lessons came in ways that nobody who witnessed them forgot. The date is sometime in the 1680s, somewhere in the Bay of Biscay, and a Corvette captain is doing something that everyone watching from the other ship considers suicidal. He is sailing directly toward a frigate. A frigate was to a Corvette what a lion is to a fast dog. Longer, more guns, a heavier hull built to take punishment and keep fighting. The standard wisdom of the era said that a Corvette encountering a frigate on open water had one correct response. Run. Use the speed. Use the shallow draft. Get to water. The frigate cannot follow. The Corvette captain in question had decided the standard wisdom was wrong. Or at least wrong in this specific situation on this specific night. What he had that the frigate did not was information. He had spent the previous 2 days watching that frigate from a distance. He knew it was short on crew because he had seen the small boats moving between it and a nearby port, ferrying men who had apparently fallen sick. He knew the frigate was carrying a load of cannon shot that made it sit lower and heavier than usual. And he knew, from the way the ship had been manoeuvring, that its captain was cautious, a man who liked favourable odds before committing. What the Corvette captain planned to do was take those favourable odds away before the frigate captain could set them up. He attacked at night, coming in from downwind so that the sound of his approach was carried away from the frigate rather than toward it. He ordered his gun ports kept closed until the last possible moment. In the darkness, a ship running without light showing its gun ports was almost invisible against the black water. The first the frigate crew knew of the Corvette was when it came alongside at speed, close enough to reach across the rail, and opened every gun port at once. The broadside at that range was not an attempt to sink the ship. It was an attempt to stun it, to kill or wound the men on deck, to destroy the rigging, to set fires in enough places that the crew would be fighting the ship rather than fighting the Corvette. Then came the boarding party. Corvette crews trained for this. Grappling hooks went over the frigate's rail, chains were pulled tight, and men crossed the gap between the ships in the chaos of smoke and noise before the frigate's crew could form up and resist properly. The fight lasted less than 30 minutes. The frigate's captain, facing a deck already burning in 2 places and a boarding party that had taken the forecastle, made the decision that saved the rest of his crew. He struck his colours. He surrendered. The Corvette had taken a ship twice its size. Stories like this one, and there were several across the period, built the Corvette's reputation into something almost mythological among the sailors and merchants of the era. The ship that could take anything. The captain who found a way when there was no way. But the larger story of what Corvettes were doing to entire coastlines and entire populations was only beginning to come into focus. Stand on the shore of a small coastal village in southern Spain in the year 1603. The fishing boats went out before dawn. The women are mending nets, children are playing near the water. The priest is ringing the bell for the morning service. Then someone screams from the headland. A sail, low hull, 2 masts, running fast toward the beach. The village had about 4 minutes. Some ran for the hills behind the town. Some ran for the church, which was stone and had thick doors. Some did not run fast enough. The Barbary corsairs raided the coastlines of southern Europe for over 200 years, and the scale of what they took is still difficult to fully absorb. Historians who have studied the records from Spanish, Italian, French and Portuguese ports estimate that between 1 million and 1.25 million Europeans were captured and enslaved by North African corsairs between 1530 and 1780. The Corvette was the instrument of almost every one of those raids. This is a chapter of history that sat in the background of European consciousness for generations and has only recently started receiving the serious attention it deserves. The system worked like this. Corsair captains out of Algiers, Tunis and Sale sailed north and west in their corvettes, sometimes travelling as far as Iceland and the coast of Ireland. They raided coastal villages, fishing fleets and merchant ships. The people they captured were brought back to North African ports and sold. Some became household servants. Some worked as skilled labourers, some were put to work in the households of wealthy merchants. A significant number were ransomed back to their families or their governments for cash. The ransoming system became its own industry. Religious orders in Spain and France specialised in raising money to buy captives back. Letters from enslaved Europeans survive in archives across the Mediterranean world, written in cramped, frightened handwriting, begging relatives and community leaders to find the money before the writer was sold further inland where communication became impossible. The Corvette that made all of this possible was chosen for this specific work. Its speed meant that a raiding party could hit a coastal village and be back out of range of any defence within an hour. Its shallow draft meant it could beach directly, putting armed men ashore in seconds. Its size meant it was cheap enough to run on a profit model where the cargo was human beings, and the captains who ran these voyages kept careful accounts. The archives of Algiers, some of which historians have studied in detail, show a system that was as organised as any commercial shipping operation of the period. Ships, crews, routes, prices, insurance against loss, everything treated as a business transaction. The Europeans who survived captivity and made it home changed the way their communities thought about the sea. Fishing villages that had sat open on beaches for centuries began building watchtowers. Church bells developed a specific pattern for the Corsair alarm, and the sight of a Corvette on the horizon stopped being just a threat to merchants. It became a threat to everyone. It starts with smoke. A column of dark smoke rising from a headland tower above a small bay in Sicily. Then another column answering it from a hill 3 miles along the coast. Then another. The signal chain moves faster than any ship can sail. By the time the Corvette rounds the point and the village comes into view, the beach is empty. This was the coastal defence system that communities across the Mediterranean and the Atlantic shores of Europe built in direct response to the Corvette threat. The watchtower network. Hundreds of stone towers, built at high points along the coast, each one within sight of the next, each one staffed by a watchman whose entire job was to look at the sea. The towers are still standing today. Drive along the coast of southern Italy, Sicily, Sardinia, the Spanish coastline, or the Algarve of Portugal and you will see them. Round stone towers on cliff tops and headlands, some of them crumbling, some remarkably intact. They do not look like much from a distance. They look like what they are, simple structures built by frightened people for a very specific purpose. The watch system worked reasonably well when the Corvette threat was limited to daylight raids by ships that had to approach from open water. A lookout with good eyes could spot a suspicious sail 2 or 3 miles away, well before it could reach the shore. He lit his fire. The signal travelled down the coast. Villages had time to hide people and valuables, to lock their churches and stone buildings, to get the elderly and the children away from the water. But Corvette captains adapted. Night raids became common specifically because they defeated the watchtower system. A dark hull running without lights on a moonless night was almost impossible to see from a tower until it was already in the bay. By the time the watchman recognised the shape and lit his fire, the boats were already in the water. Some captains used fog the same way. The Mediterranean coastline in autumn and spring produces morning sea fogs that settle over bays and inlets in thick white blankets. A Corvette captain who knew the local weather patterns could time his approach to arrive inside the fog, navigate by memory and current to a village he had reconnoitred on a previous visit, and put his raiding party ashore while the tower watchman sat in a white cloud with no view of anything beyond his own boots. The watchtower system forced Corsair captains to be more creative, but the creativity ran in both directions. Communities hired guides, local sailors who had been captured and returned, or who had sailed the Corsair routes and knew how the captains thought. These men advised on what a Corvette captain would look for in a potential raid site, which villages were vulnerable, which approaches were predictable. The anxiety that settled into these coastal communities was not just about individual raids. It was about the persistent possibility of a raid, any morning, any night, year after year, decade after decade. Children grew up knowing what the smoke signal meant. Fishermen spent their whole lives making a calculation each morning about whether to take the boat out or stay on shore. The entire relationship between people and the sea along these coasts was reshaped by one small, fast ship. And the people on that ship had their own complicated story. The hold is dark, and the ship is moving. If you are one of the captives from this morning's raid, you're lying or sitting in a space below the waterline with perhaps 40 or 50 other people, in the dark, on a ship you have never been on before, heading toward a place you have only heard about in frightening stories. The crossing from a Spanish or Italian coastal village to a North African port took anywhere from 2 days to 2 weeks, depending on where along the coast the raid happened and what winds the captain had. For the captives below deck, that time was marked by thirst, fear, and a physical discomfort that historical accounts describe in precise, miserable detail. What happened when the ship arrived depended on several factors, and historians who have worked through the archives of Algiers and other Corsair ports have put together a detailed picture of a system that was, in its own brutal way, highly organised. The captives were assessed on arrival: age, health, apparent skill level, appearance. These factors determined price and placement. Young, healthy men with visible skills, someone whose hands showed he was a blacksmith or a carpenter, were valuable as craftsmen and might end up working in relatively stable conditions. Women and children were assessed differently. Elderly captives were the hardest to place, and their outcomes were often the worst. Some captives were bought almost immediately by wealthy households in Algiers or Tunis and spent their enslavement in domestic service. This was considered the better outcome, relatively speaking. They had shelter, regular food, and some degree of stability. Others went to work in the bagnios, large communal holding facilities where captives lived collectively while their status was sorted out. The bagnios of Algiers have been described by multiple survivors, and what they describe is a world unto itself. Thousands of people from dozens of different countries, speaking different languages, observing different religions, thrown together in a confined space and developing their own internal hierarchy and community. Trade happened in the bagnios. Captives who had skills or connections could sometimes earn small amounts of money. Some ran small shops or service businesses within the bagnio walls. A few accumulated enough to pay part of their own ransom. The ransom system was the dominant fact of life for most captives from Western Europe. If your family had money, if your community had money, if a religious order took interest in your case, you might come home. Letters went back and forth across the Mediterranean. Priests acted as negotiators. Banks in Genoa and Marseille processed ransom payments as routine financial transactions. If no ransom came, the options narrowed. Conversion to Islam opened certain doors that were otherwise closed, and the records show a significant number of European captives who made that choice after years of waiting for a ransom that never arrived. The captives who made it home brought their stories with them. Those stories shaped how people across Europe understood the world beyond the horizon, and they shaped how governments and navies thought about the Corvette and the captains who sailed it. The pressure to do something about it was building. Her name does not appear in the official record. She appears once in the testimony of a captured merchant sailor giving his account to a Spanish port authority in 1672. He describes the boarding party that came over the rail of his ship. He describes the fighting. And then, in the middle of a list of details, he mentions almost in passing that one of the figures directing the boarding from the Corvette's deck was a woman. The official taking the deposition does not follow up on this. he moves on to questions about cargo and destination. Women on corvettes are one of the most contested and underexplored areas of this history. The official record, built by port authorities, naval registries and government documents, reflects the world as institutions wanted it to be. Crews were male, ships had captains who were male, the sea was a male space and its record keepers wrote accordingly. The unofficial record is more complicated. Across the period when corvettes dominated sea raiding, accounts surface repeatedly in survivor testimonies, in letters, in travellers' descriptions, and in the records of ransomed captives that mention women in operational roles on these vessels. Some accounts are clearly exaggerated or confused. A figure in loose clothing seen at a distance in the chaos of a boarding could easily be misidentified. But the volume and consistency of the accounts across different sources and different decades makes wholesale dismissal difficult. What the historical picture suggests is that women on corvettes existed in several different categories. Some were captives who were kept aboard ship during extended voyages, rather than being transferred to a holding facility. The records of several ransomed Europeans describe spending weeks or months aboard the ship that captured them before being brought to port. Some appear to have been the companions or partners of captains, present on the ship not as crew, but as part of the captain's personal household, which sometimes moved with him. And a smaller number appear in accounts as active participants in ship operations. The testimony of the Spanish merchant sailor is one example. There are others, scattered across French, Italian and English sources, that describe women in positions that imply at least some degree of authority or function. The Barbary corsair world was in some ways more open to unconventional arrangements than European naval forces, which enforced strict regulations. Corsair captains had more independence and more room to organize their ships as they saw fit. The business model was profit-driven. If someone was useful, they were used. The most famous case in related history is not a corvette case specifically, but belongs to the same world. Anne Bonny and Mary Red, two women who sailed on a Caribbean pirate sloop in the early 1700s and were documented in the historical record at their trial. Their case is exceptional precisely because it made it into official proceedings. Most women who moved through the sea raiding world left no such clear trail. What we know is that the sea was not as exclusively male as the formal record suggests. The corvette, with its small crew, its mobility, and its independence from formal naval structures, was exactly the kind of vessel where the rules bent. And just off the horizon, there was a kind of operation where those bent rules became the entire point. The order passed from man to man in a whisper. No lights, no metal on metal. Move slowly and stay low. The corvette had been running dark for 3 hours. No lanterns, no fire in the cook stove. The captain had ordered the crew into bare feet an hour before midnight because the sound of boots on a wooden deck travels across water in a way that a careful ear can pick up from 100 yards. The night boarding was a technique refined over generations of sea raiding, and by the 1600s it had developed into something close to a tactical science. The goal was simple: get the boarding party from the corvette's deck to the target ship's deck before anyone on the target ship raised an alarm. Every second of surprise was worth 10 seconds of fighting. The target vessel, a merchant ship hove to for the night with reduced sail, was ahead in the darkness. The corvette captain had found it by sound. A large ship at anchor or sailing slowly at night makes noise that carries across the water, the creak of its rigging, the slap of waves against its hull, the occasional voice from its deck watch. The corvette came in from downwind and from the dark side, the side away from the moon if there was one, or from the direction of the darkest horizon if there was not. The helmsman held a course that would bring the ship alongside the target without the approach angle requiring any adjustment that might cause noise or movement visible from the target's deck. The grappling hooks were ready. These were iron hooks on long lines, weighted and shaped to catch a ship's rail on the first throw if possible. In a night boarding, the hooks went over in silence, lowered hand over hand rather than thrown, and the lines were pulled tight slowly to avoid the bang of iron on wood that would ring out like a bell in the quiet. The boarding party was ready at the rail. 20 men typically, though numbers varied, armed with short blades and clubs rather than guns because a gunshot in the dark confused everything and could kill your own people as easily as the enemy. The objective was to get enough men onto the target deck to control it before the watch raised an alarm and the sleeping crew below decks came up armed and fighting. What the boarding party knew and what made them effective was the layout of merchant ships. They had almost certainly raided ships of this type before. They knew where the hatch to the crew quarters was. They knew where the captain's cabin sat. They knew the watch would be 2 or 3 men, exhausted, standing on a dark deck after hours of nothing. The first men over the rail went directly for the watch, quietly, covering mouths, getting men to the deck without the shout that would change everything. Sometimes it worked perfectly. The ship was taken before anyone below woke up. Sometimes someone shouted, and then the night went from quiet to chaos in seconds. What that chaos produced, the deals made, the violence, the human decisions under enormous pressure, was a story that different men remembered differently for the rest of their lives. And on the other side of the equation, there was one man whose life was defined by this kind of operation. He grew up with his hands in nets and his eyes on the water. Jean Bart was born in Dunkirk in 1650, the son of a fisherman who worked the shallow, dangerous waters of the North Sea. There was nothing in his childhood that suggested greatness. There was poverty. There was hard work. There was the sea, always the sea, in every direction and in every season of a childhood spent on the coast of what is now northern France. He went to sea young, as boys in fishing families did. He learned the North Sea from the deck up and the hull down, its tidal patterns, its hidden sandbanks, its sudden, violent storms that came in off the Atlantic with almost no warning. He learned the way experienced fishermen learn things, not from books, but from experience that puts fear in you and then teaches you what to do with it. At some point in his teens, he moved from fishing boats to warships. He served under the Dutch Admiral Michiel de Ruyter, one of the finest commanders of the period, and learned the principles of naval tactics from a man who had spent his entire career thinking about how to use speed, surprise, and knowledge of shallow water to defeat enemies who had more ships and more guns. De Ruyter saw something in the young man from Dunkirk and gave him responsibility early. When France and the Dutch Republic went to war and political loyalty became a complicated question for a man who had learned from the enemy, Jean Bart made his choice and moved to the French side. The French Navy recognized his value and gave him ships. They gave him a Corvette. What followed was a career that historians describe as one of the most remarkable in the history of Northern European sea raiding. Jean Bart operated primarily in the English Channel and the North Sea, the most contested stretch of water in the world during the last decades of the 1600s. English, Dutch, and French naval forces were all operating in the same waters, plus a significant population of privateers and outright pirates who used the confusion of wartime to move between legal and illegal raiding as opportunity allowed. His tactics were distinctly his own. He avoided large fleet engagements where a single ship's impact was limited. He preferred operations where speed and surprise could substitute for firepower. He chose targets with careful analysis, calculating which ships carried the most valuable cargo and which were most vulnerable to his approach. He was, in the language of a later era, a precision instrument in a world that mostly used hammers. One operation in particular became legendary. In 1694, he attacked a massive convoy of roughly 100 grain ships being escorted toward France through the North Sea. He scattered the escort, captured or recaptured the grain ships, and brought them to a French port at a moment when France was facing a serious food shortage. The rescue of that convoy, accomplished with a small fleet of corvettes against a significantly larger Dutch naval force, made him famous across Europe. The French king raised him to the nobility. Jean Bart, fisherman's son, became a knight. He died in 1702, still sailing, still planning the next operation. And the city he left behind in North Africa, the capital of the entire Corsair economy, was about to come into view. Walk through the gates of Algiers in the year 1650, and the first thing you notice is the noise. The harbour is full of ships, corvettes mostly, their hulls dark with tar, their sails furled and drying in the afternoon sun. Sailors and merchants move along the docks in a dozen languages: Arabic, Turkish, Spanish, Italian, French. The market behind the waterfront is crammed with goods from every shore of the Mediterranean and beyond. Silk from France, silver from Spanish mines in the Americas, cloth from England, ivory and gold from further south. Almost all of it arrived on a corvette. Algiers in the 16 and 1700s was one of the wealthiest cities in the Mediterranean world, and it had built that wealth almost entirely through the operations of its Corsair fleet. The city functioned as a kind of corporate headquarters for sea raiding. The Corsair captains were its executives. The beys and days who governed the city were its board of directors, and the corvette was the instrument that generated the revenue. The economic system was sophisticated enough to impress historians who have studied it in detail. Ship ownership was divided into shares, the same way businesses today issue stock. A merchant in Algiers could buy a share of a Corsair corvette's next voyage and receive a portion of whatever prizes it brought back. The risk was spread, the profit was shared, and the city as a whole had a financial stake in the success of every ship that left its harbour. The captains themselves operated under a licensing system. They applied to the governing authority for permission to sail and agreed to a percentage split of their prizes. The government of Algiers took its cut of everything. In return, it provided the harbour, the repair facilities, the markets where prizes could be sold, and the legal framework, such as it was, that gave Corsair operations at least a surface of legitimacy in the complex politics of the Mediterranean. The ransom economy ran alongside the raiding economy. The bagnios where captives were held were operated under city oversight. Ransom negotiations were conducted through officially recognised intermediaries. The prices were set by a market, responsive to supply and demand the way any commodity market is. A skilled craftsman from a wealthy Spanish city commanded a higher ransom than a fisherman from a poor Portuguese village, and the system priced them accordingly. What the city built with this income was impressive by any standard of the era. The old city of Algiers, the Casbah, still stands in much of its original form. Its mosques and fountains and covered markets were built in an era of significant wealth. Its fortifications were maintained by the proceeds of the Corsair trade. Its charitable institutions, the schools and hospitals and water systems, were funded by the same source. The people who lived in Algiers understood this connection clearly. The Corsairs were celebrated figures. A successful captain returning with a loaded prize ship was a public hero. His crew received their shares and spent them in the city's markets, spreading the wealth through the local economy in the way that successful industries always do. And in the ransom offices along the harbour, letters were being written. The letter is dated 1647. A man named Miguel is writing from the bagnio in Algiers, and the paper he's writing on is thin, and the ink is pale, and every word costs him something to put down. He writes to his brother in Valencia. He is alive. He is healthy, mostly. He has been in Algiers for 14 months. He has done his best to present himself as useful. He has been learning some words in Arabic. He is trying. Then he writes the number, the amount needed to bring him home. It is more than his brother makes in 3 years. Letters from European captives in North African ports survive in archives from Spain, Italy, France, Portugal, and England, and historians who have worked through them describe a body of writing that is both heartbreaking and astonishingly specific. These are not vague cries of distress. They are practical documents written by people who understood the system they were trapped in and were trying to work it toward their survival. The letter writers knew that a convincing ransom request required information: who was available to pay, what resources the family had, whether a church or a charitable society might contribute, whether the writer had connections to someone wealthy or powerful who might intervene. They also knew that too high a number would mean no ransom came at all, because the family simply could not raise it. Too low a number and the captive's owner would reject the offer and wait for better. The negotiation was real, and the captives who understood it best had the best chance of coming home. Some letters contain detailed instructions. Go to this merchant. He knows our family. Speak to the priest at the church. He has contacts with the Trinitarians, a religious order that specialized in ransoming captives. Do not sell the land. I will come back. Sell the land if you must. Getting me home is worth it. Others are harder to read. A woman writing to her husband in 1662 asks him to hurry. She does not explain why she needs him to hurry. She just writes the word several times. Hurry. Please, hurry. The Trinitarian friars and the Mercedarian friars were two Catholic religious orders that made the ransoming of captives their primary mission during this period. They travelled to North African ports, negotiated with corsair authorities and slave owners, and brought captives home in organised groups. The records of their operations show thousands of individual ransoms arranged over roughly 2 centuries, a running account of the human cost of the Corvette economy. The money came from charity collections taken in churches across Spain, France, and Italy. Entire communities contributed to ransom funds, understanding that the people locked in those bagnios could just as easily have been them. What is striking about the letters, reading them now in archive boxes in Madrid and Palermo and Marseille, is how ordinary they are alongside the extraordinary circumstances. A man asking after the harvest. A woman asking whether her mother's health has improved. A son asking whether the younger children are still in school. Life, insisting on itself even from inside a cage. And back on the sea, the navies of Europe were still trying to figure out how to stop the ships that put those people there. The answer, when it finally came, arrived from an unexpected direction entirely. The Admiral is standing at the window of his office in Lisbon, looking at the harbour. He has just received another report. Another convoy hit. Another corvette moving too fast, gone before the patrol ship arrived. He sets the paper down and looks at the water, and tries to think of something new to try. He cannot. For over 2 centuries, European naval powers threw resources at the problem of the Corsair corvette and came back with results that range from modest to embarrassing. The difficulty was structural. The navies of Spain, France, England, Portugal, and the Dutch Republic were built around large ships. Heavy frigates, ships of the line, vessels designed to fight other large ships in formal fleet engagements on open water. The corvette did not fight that way. It scattered when the big ships came. It vanished into shallow water. It changed routes. It operated in areas where large warships could not follow, and in weather conditions where heavy ships sat helpless. The two systems barely intersected, and when they did, the corvette simply left. Spain tried treaty agreements with the North African states, paying annual tribute in exchange for protection of Spanish shipping. The arrangements worked sometimes for a while, until a change of leadership in Algiers or a shift in political relationships broke the deal, and the raids resumed. Portugal signed similar agreements. France did the same. The payments amounted to an ongoing tax on European commerce paid directly to the Corsair economy. England tried military force twice in the 1600s, and both expeditions achieved far less than intended. The problem was always the same. English warships could bombard Algiers from the sea. They could destroy buildings along the waterfront. They could sink ships that were in the harbour when they arrived. But the Corsair fleet, warned of the approaching squadron by scouts and by the simple visibility of a large fleet at sea, had dispersed long before the English ships arrived. The corvettes were somewhere else entirely, safe in small harbours up and down the coast, waiting for the warships to leave. The Dutch sent an expedition in 1624 that had similar results, dramatic on the surface, limited in actual effect. The Corsair fleet absorbed the damage and rebuilt. Individual European captains occasionally had success against Corsair corvettes in open water. A fast frigate with a skilled crew could sometimes run a corvette down if the conditions were right and the corvette captain made an error. These chases produced genuine prizes on both sides. The Mediterranean and Atlantic records are full of individual encounters that went one way or the other. But ending the system required something that naval force alone could not deliver: a political change in the North African states themselves, a reason for the governing authorities of Algiers and Tunis to decide that the Corsair economy was more trouble than it was worth. And that calculation kept coming out the same way for 200 years. The trade was profitable. The tribute payments from European powers validated the system. The political structure of the Barbary states depended on Corsair revenue. Nobody in a position of power in Algiers had a financial interest in stopping the ships. A few European voices argued that the answer was trade, not force. That building genuine commercial relationships with North African ports would make raiding less profitable relative to legitimate business. These arguments were largely ignored by governments that preferred the visible drama of naval expeditions. The merchant captains and their crews kept paying the price of that preference, and somewhere in the courts of Europe a legal argument was developing that would change the whole nature of the question. The document is written on heavy paper and sealed with red wax. It is called a letter of marque, and it is the difference between a legal captain and a criminal one, technically. The letter of marque was a license issued by a government authorizing a private ship captain to attack and seize the vessels of enemy nations during wartime. The captain who held one was a privateer. He kept a percentage of whatever he took. His government got a cut. Everybody was, within the definition of the law at the time, operating legitimately. The captain who did exactly the same thing without the letter was a pirate. In theory, the distinction was clean and important. In practice, it was one of the most elastic legal concepts in the history of maritime law, stretched and bent so routinely that historians who study it sometimes describe the line between privateer and pirate as less a boundary and more a suggestion. The problem started with the letters themselves. They were issued for specific wars against specific enemies. When the war ended, the letter expired. A captain who had been raiding French ships legally for 3 years under an English letter of marque suddenly found himself in a situation where the same action that made him a hero last year made him a criminal today. Some captains accepted this transition and went back to legitimate trade or found naval employment. Others found the habits of raiding too profitable and too ingrained to abandon, simply because a treaty had been signed in a room they had never visited. The Corvette made this particular ambiguity worse. Because the ship was affordable and widely available, the population of private captains operating them was large. And because the Corvette was fast and mobile, a captain who chose to continue raiding after his letter expired was very hard to catch. Governments knew this and used it deliberately. During wartime, they issued letters of marque freely, expanding their offensive capacity at no direct cost to the treasury. When peace came, they could officially denounce the same captains for continuing to raid, even while privately understanding that the threat of these captains was still useful pressure on rival powers. Jean Bart himself navigated this world with care. His status shifted several times over his career from corsair to licensed privateer to official naval officer and back again depending on the state of French politics and the current war. He was a legal combatant when France needed him to be, and a deniable asset when that was more useful. The Barbary captains operated under a different legal framework that European powers chose to treat as equivalent to the letter of marque system when it suited them, and as outright piracy when it did not. The political flexibility was impressive and entirely cynical on all sides. What the privateer system created, across 2 centuries of use, was a large population of skilled, armed, mobile sea raiders who had been trained and equipped by governments and then periodically cut loose. The Corvette gave those men their weapon. The legal ambiguity gave them their operating space. And the specific experience of being inside a Corvette broadside, the moment when all that legal theory collapsed into pure physics, was something that survivors described in terms that had nothing to do with paperwork. You smell it before you hear it. A sharp, chemical smell, something between a struck match and burning wood drifting across the water on the wind. Then the sound hits. A rolling crack that is too big to be a single noise, more like the sky tearing open, bouncing off the water and hitting you in the chest before your brain has finished processing what your ears heard. Then, the smoke. A Corvette broadside at close range produced a wall of grey-white smoke that could swallow the ship in seconds. Gun crews who had just fired could see nothing. They worked by feel and by the pattern drilled into their muscles over hundreds of practice sessions. Sponge the barrel, charge, ball, ram, prime, run out, fire. The guns themselves were different sizes depending on the ship and the captain's preference. A typical Corvette of the mid-1700s might carry a mix of cannon sizes. Smaller guns fired balls roughly the size of a grapefruit and were used at longer ranges for harassment and rigging damage. Heavier guns, which could fire a ball the weight of a bowling ball, were brought into action at close range and designed to punch through a ship's hull at the waterline. The recoil of a heavy naval cannon was something that surprised people who had never stood near one. The gun lurched backward on its carriage with a force that could kill a man who was standing in the wrong place, driving back several feet against the restraining ropes. The carriage itself shook and the deck shook with it. Men who fired guns repeatedly developed specific physical problems from the pressure waves and from handling cannon that had been in use long enough to get dangerously hot. On the receiving end, a cannonball travelling at combat velocity did not punch a clean hole. It hit wood and split it, sending jagged fragments in every direction at speeds that were often more dangerous than the ball itself. Surgeons who worked on battle casualties during this period describe wounds from wooden splinters, long shards of oak driven into bodies at angles that made them impossible to remove cleanly. The splinter wound was one of the defining injuries of naval warfare. Fire was the other constant threat. A cannonball that hit near a ship's powder magazine or its cooking area could start a fire in a ship made almost entirely of wood and canvas and rope soaked in pitch. Corvette gun crews were trained to watch for fire on the target and to adjust their aim accordingly, working to disable the ship rather than destroy it, since a ship on fire was a ship whose cargo was burning. The tactical goal of a Corvette broadside was specifically calculated. The objective was usually the target ship's rigging rather than its hull. Take down a mast, shred a sail, cut a critical piece of running rigging, and the target ship could not maneuver or run. Once it was immobilized, the boarding could happen at the Corvette captain's leisure. It was a brutal and precise science, developed over decades of practice against real targets. And when the smoke finally cleared and the ships came together, what happened in the minutes after was often stranger and more human than the violence that preceded it. The captain is standing at the stern, not looking at the ship ahead. He is looking at the clouds. Specifically, he is looking at a line of low, dark cloud building on the southwestern horizon and the way the swell is running slightly ahead of the wind, which tells him the weather behind those clouds is moving faster than it appears. He has about 2 hours before conditions change significantly. The question is whether that is enough time to run down the merchant vessel 3 miles to the north, take what he needs from it, and be clear of the area before the wind shifts and the sea gets complicated. He decides it is. He gives the order. Weather was the Sea Raiders' most powerful ally and most dangerous enemy, and the Corvette captains who lasted in the trade were invariably the ones who had developed an understanding of meteorology that was practical, precise, and entirely self-taught. There were no weather forecasts, there were no radio reports. There was the sky, the sea, the wind on your skin, and the knowledge in your head built from years of watching all three. The Mediterranean has its own weather personality, built around a set of named winds that sailors of the period knew as well as they knew their own names. The Tramontane blows cold from the north across the Ligurian Sea. The Sirocco comes warm and wet from North Africa, carrying red Saharan dust that settled on everything and made visibility unpredictable. The Mistral comes hard out of the Rhone Valley and can build from nothing to a full gale in less than 3 hours. Atlantic weather was larger in scale and in consequence. The Bay of Biscay, which sits between the coast of France and the coast of northern Spain, has a reputation for sudden and severe storms that is entirely deserved. Corvette captains operating there needed to be able to read the barometric pressure changes that preceded a gale, which they did by watching the behaviour of seabirds, the colour of the horizon at sunset, the specific quality of the swell, and the feel of the air pressure against their sinuses, a skill that experienced sailors developed with the same reliability as a barometer. Getting the weather wrong had consequences that could not be undone. A corvette caught in a full Atlantic gale without sea room, meaning without enough open water to run safely downwind, was in serious danger. The hull was strong, but it was also small and light, which meant it was thrown around by heavy seas in ways that large ships with their greater inertia resisted better. Several corvettes were lost to weather during this period with all hands. The ship and crew simply swallowed by a sea that gave no warning anyone survived to report. The captains who built reputations understood that a successful operation began with the weather decision, not with the chase. Choosing the right time of year, reading the sky on the morning of a planned raid, knowing when to abort an approach because the signs were wrong. These were the decisions that determined who was still sailing after 10 years and who was not. Jean Bart was famously skilled at reading the North Sea, whose weather is some of the most complicated and changeable in the world. His ability to operate in conditions that kept other captains in harbour was a significant tactical advantage. A corvette that could sail in weather nobody else would attempt had access to sea lanes that were effectively empty of competition and defence. The weather was a weapon. The best captains used it like one. And then there were the battles where the weapons were borrowed from another nation entirely. It is 1777, and a French corvette is running hard through the Atlantic, carrying something more valuable than cargo: information. The American colonies are at war with Britain. France, which has its own long history of grievances against the British Crown, is watching with great interest, and the corvette, fast and hard to intercept, has become the courier that connects the American revolutionaries to the European powers that might help them. The role of French corvettes in the American Revolution is a chapter of the story that tends to get compressed in popular history, but the details are significant. France entered the war formally in 1778, declaring alliance with the American side and committing naval and military resources to the conflict. What made that alliance effective, practically and strategically, was the disruption of British supply lines across the Atlantic. Britain's ability to wage war in North America depended on ships. Men, weapons, ammunition, food, and pay all had to cross an ocean that was roughly 3,000 miles wide. The supply chain was long, predictable in its basic routes, and vulnerable to exactly the kind of fast, aggressive interdiction that corvettes were built to deliver. French corvette captains operating in the western Atlantic and along the American coastline spent the war years picking apart British logistics. A supply ship separated from its convoy escort was vulnerable. A small naval vessel detached on courier duty was a prize. Even the threat of French corvettes operating in waters the British had previously considered safe forced the Royal Navy to dedicate warship resources to convoy escort that would otherwise have been available for offensive operations. The impact was cumulative rather than dramatic. No single corvette action turned the war, but across 4 years of sustained harassment, the diversion of British naval attention and the interruption of supply lines contributed to a British strategic situation that was consistently worse than their commanders had hoped for at the start. American privateers ran their own corvette-sized vessels in the same campaign. Ships like the Ranger, commanded by John Paul Jones, operated with the same logic that Barbary captains had used for generations: speed, surprise, the willingness to attack where defences were thin. Jones famously took the fight into British home waters, raiding the port of Whitehaven on the English coast in 1778, the first hostile attack on a British port since the 17th century. The British response to French corvette operations was the same response that had frustrated European naval planners for 2 centuries: try to catch them with bigger ships, fail because the bigger ships were slower, attempt to cut off their ports, watch them disperse to other ports. What the American Revolution demonstrated was that the corvette's tactical value had not diminished. If anything, it had clarified. In a war where one side depended on a long ocean supply chain and the other had allies with fast ships, the corvette was as decisive as it had ever been. And in that same era, one particular chase was playing out in the Mediterranean that would be talked about for decades afterward. The British patrol sloop left Gibraltar on a Tuesday morning in 1781 with specific orders: find the Barbary corvette that had been raiding merchant traffic in the western Mediterranean and either capture it or drive it off. The corvette had hit 3 ships in 6 weeks, taken their cargoes, and disappeared each time before any response could be organised. The sloop's captain was a careful man. He had detailed the known routes of the Barbary vessel, the areas it had operated in, the coastal features it seemed to favour for its approaches. He had talked to the surviving captains of the 3 raided ships. He had a theory about where the corvette was based and where it would go next. For the first 12 hours, the theory seemed right. A lookout spotted a low-hulled vessel running south along the Spanish coastline at a distance that made identification uncertain. The sloop gave chase. The other vessel increased speed. By midday, the chase was confirmed. The corvette had been found. What followed was 4 days of a cat-and-mouse pursuit that covered roughly 400 miles of water and involved almost every advantage that either ship possessed. The corvette ran south, then cut east along the Moroccan coast, using the coastline as cover and the shallow inshore channels as refuge when the sloop pressed too close. The British captain could not follow into the shoalless water without risking his own keel on rocks the corvette captain apparently knew by feel. Each time the sloop closed the distance on open water, the corvette turned for shore and the chase reset. On the second day, the wind dropped significantly. Both ships crawled. The corvette used oars. Sweeps is what sailors called the long oars deployed through special ports in a ship's side to maintain movement when the sails hung useless. The sloop tried the same and found that its heavier hull moved more slowly under oar power. The gap between them widened. On the third day, the wind returned from the north and both captains drove their crews hard. The sloop gained ground consistently on open water, its crew working the sails with the desperation of men who'd been chasing for 3 days. The corvette captain appeared to change tactics. Instead of running for the coast, he turned and headed south and west into open water, The British captain recognised this as either a mistake or a trap. He followed anyway. The fourth day brought fog in the morning, a thick Atlantic mist that reduced visibility to the length of a ship. Both vessels navigated by sound. The sloop's crew could hear the Corvette's hull moving through the water somewhere ahead in the white nothing. They maintained direction by compass and hope. When the fog cleared in the late afternoon, the Corvette was gone. The British captain sailed the area for another day, checked the nearest Moroccan coastal settlements, and eventually turned back toward Gibraltar, with nothing to show for 4 days of effort, except a crew that was exhausted and a report that his commanding admiral would not enjoy reading. The Corvette appeared again 6 weeks later, 300 miles away, raiding near Sardinia. But even among the most successful Corsair captains, there were lines, rules, an unspoken code that some followed and others broke without hesitation. There were rules, unofficial ones, agreed on by no treaty and written in no document, but real enough that captains who violated them suffered for it, sometimes from their own crews, sometimes from the communities that supported them. The broadest version of the code went something like this. A ship that surrendered without a fight had earned a certain treatment. Its crew should be kept alive. Personal property below a certain value should be left alone. The captain should be treated with a minimum of dignity. Women and children aboard should be separated from the general captive population and handled carefully. This code was not universal. It was honoured more in some places and among some captains than others. But it existed, and captains who followed it were known for it, and that reputation served them practically in ways that purely brutal captains did not benefit from. A merchant community that knew certain captains operated by recognisable rules was a community more likely to surrender quickly, which was exactly what a Corvette captain wanted. A merchant captain who believed that surrender meant reasonable treatment was a merchant captain who did not fight to the last, who did not put his ship and its cargo at risk of being damaged or destroyed in a resistance that was probably hopeless anyway. Terror was a tool, but calibrated terror was more useful than pure violence. Jean Bart was known for a version of this. He was not gentle. He ran hard operations and he didn't hesitate to use force when he needed to. But accounts from the period describe him as a captain who treated captured crews with a certain rough respect, who did not permit his men to abuse prisoners, who kept his word when he gave it during a negotiation. This reputation contributed directly to the number of ships that surrendered to him without significant resistance. The captains who broke the code were a different story. Records from the period, specifically the survivor testimonies collected by Spanish and Italian port authorities from ransomed captives, describe a range of treatment that varied enormously from one Corsair captain to the next. Some captains ran orderly operations with clear hierarchies and predictable rules. Others allowed their crews latitude that produced violence, theft of personal property, abuse of captives, and worse. The captains who permitted or encouraged the worst treatment tended to have shorter careers. Crews were more likely to consider mutiny. Ports that knew their reputation became less welcoming, and the merchant community developed informal networks for sharing information about which captains to fear in a specific way and which to fear in a manageable way. There was also the question of ransom. A captain who damaged or killed the people he captured was a captain who was destroying his own inventory. Ransomable captives had financial value. A dead captive was worth nothing. This commercial logic acted as a brake on the worst impulses, though an imperfect one. The line between the code and its violation was always personal. It lived in the character of the captain and the culture he built among his crew. A Corvette was small enough that the captain's personality reached every corner of it. His standards, or his absence of them, were everyone's reality. And on a small ship with no escape from each other, those realities sometimes reached a breaking point, The captain does not see it coming. He almost never does. A Corvette mutiny had a specific character that was different from mutinies on larger vessels. On a ship of the line with a crew of several hundred men, a mutiny required organisation, a network of conspirators, and a critical mass of grievance large enough to overcome the inertia of a large hierarchical organisation. It took time, it required planning. On a Corvette with 60 men in a space barely larger than a suburban house, the dynamics were more intimate and more volatile. Everyone knew everyone. The captain's mood was visible to the whole crew every day. Every decision about food, about prize money, about which targets to chase and which to avoid, was made in a space small enough that the reasoning behind it was obvious to people who were paying attention. The grievances that produced Corvette mutinies were almost always the same in their basic shape. Pay disputes, specifically the feeling that the captain or the officers were taking more than their agreed share of prize money. Food and water shortages that were seen as the result of bad planning or deliberate withholding. Violence from officers that crossed the unwritten line between discipline and cruelty, and routes or operations that the crew believed were recklessly dangerous without proportionate reward. The historical record on Corvette mutinies is incomplete because the events that produced them were rarely documented by the people involved. Survivors of failed mutinies were unlikely to submit written accounts. Successful mutinies produced captains with strong reasons to claim the previous captain died of natural causes. What the record does show, assembled from port authority documents, from trial records in cases where mutineers were caught, and from the accounts of released captives who witnessed events aboard ship, is that these events were more common than the official history suggests. The mechanics were straightforward. The instigators were almost always experienced sailors with social standing among the crew. A boatswain or a gunner, men whose daily work put them in contact with the whole crew and gave them the authority to speak across the social divides of rank. They identified the threshold of collective grievance. They talked to men individually and built a coalition before ever moving openly. When they moved fast, because on a small ship speed was everything. The goal was to secure the quarterdeck, which was the captain's domain, before he could arm himself or rally the officers who might be loyal to him. On a Corvette, the quarterdeck was perhaps 30 feet from any point on the deck. There was no long corridor to rush, no companionway that could be defended. The captain's isolation, once the decision was made, was essentially immediate. Some captains, sensing the shift before it became open, managed to ride it out, giving ground on the grievance, redistributing prize money, apologizing even, in the rough language of men who never used that word lightly. Others ended up in a small boat with whatever provisions the new captain chose to give them, watching their own ship sail away. And what those captains carried in their coat pockets, the objects and documents that defined their identity and their authority on the water, revealed how this world actually worked. The coat is heavy. It does not look heavy from the outside. Dark wool, well made, with the practical cut of a working sailor, rather than the decorative excess of a naval officer in a formal portrait. But pick it up, and it is heavier than it should be. The weight is in the lining. Corvette captains who operated in the raiding economy of the 16 and 1700s were, by professional necessity, their own banks. The financial system that supported normal commerce, the letters of credit and bankers' drafts and institutional accounts that merchants relied on, was not available to a sea raider operating outside of formal national navies. Cash was the universal language, and cash, for a man who lived on a ship and might be imprisoned, ransomed, shipwrecked, or forced to run at any moment, needed to be portable and hidden. The coins sewn into coat linings were the most common solution. Small denominations mixed with larger ones, stitched flat between layers of fabric, distributed around the coat so that the weight was not obvious in any one place. A captain might carry the equivalent of several months of a working sailor's wages in his coat at all times. If he was captured and stripped of everything else, the coat might survive. If he had to abandon ship and could grab only one thing, the coat was it. Beyond money, a Corvette captain typically carried a small number of documents that defined his legal status on the water. His letter of marque, if he had one. Safe conduct passes issued by various powers that could be presented to patrol ships of specific nationalities. Letters of introduction to port authorities in cities he might need to enter for repairs or provisions. He also carried navigation tools, a compass, usually a personal one that he trusted more than the ship's, because compasses varied in quality, and a trusted instrument was something a careful man kept close. Charts of the waters he knew best, folded and refolded so many times that the creases became part of the information, showing where the paper had worn at points the captain had checked most often. And captains who had developed relationships with intelligence networks, and the successful ones almost all had, carried information in their heads. The positions of patrol routes, the schedules of convoys, the names of contacts in specific ports who could be trusted to provide provisions without reporting the visit to authorities. This knowledge was worth more than any physical object and could not be confiscated. Some captains kept journals. The ones that have survived in archives are remarkable documents, mixing navigational notes with personal observations with financial accounts in a way that reflects the total integration of professional and personal life that ship command required. Every page is the same man, the captain of this vessel, making decisions about where to go and what to take and how to manage the human beings in his care. The journals that end abruptly, mid-sentence in the middle of a paragraph, tell their own story. What came next for the institution those men served? The Corsair city that bankrolled their voyages and celebrated their returns was already being decided in the war rooms of a European power that had finally run out of patience. The French fleet arrived on the morning of June 14th, 1830. It was the largest amphibious operation Europe had attempted since the Crusades. 37,000 soldiers on 600 ships, moving through clear summer water toward a coastline that had been raiding European shipping for almost 3 centuries. Algiers had survived bombardment before. The Dutch had tried in 1624. The British had sent a fleet in 1816 that fired over 30,000 shells into the city's fortifications and harbour. Each time the city absorbed the damage, rebuilt, and the Corsair trade continued. This time was different. France did not want to bombard Algiers. France wanted to take it. The political reasons behind the decision were partly about revenge for decades of Corsair raids on French shipping, and partly about domestic French politics, a government that wanted a military success. The result was an invasion force that dwarfed anything the Barbary states had faced before. The landing happened west of the city. French troops came ashore on beaches that the Corsair defenders had assumed were too exposed for a major landing, which was precisely why the French chose them. The coastal forts that defended the expected approach routes were bypassed. By the time the Algerian defenders oriented to the actual threat, the French army was already moving inland. The city fell in 3 weeks. For the Corsair economy, the capture of Algiers was not just a military defeat, it was the removal of the institutional foundation that made the whole system work. The Bays and Days who licensed the captains, who ran the ransom system, who maintained the harbour and the markets and the bagnios, were gone. The legal framework, loose as it was, that gave Corsair operations their surface legitimacy, collapsed. The Corsair captains who were at sea when Algiers fell came back to a port under French military occupation. Their ships were confiscated or destroyed. Their financial networks were dismantled. The merchants who had held shares in their voyages lost their investments. The ransom offices closed. The bagnios were emptied. Some captains dispersed along the coast to smaller ports that were still outside European control. The Corsair trade limped on at reduced scale from Tunis and Tripoli for another decade or two. But the scale was never the same. The infrastructure that had made the Barbary Corvette economy work, the city, the institutions, the markets, the political protection, was gone. European merchant ships in the Western Mediterranean began for the first time in 3 centuries to sail without the specific anxiety of the Corsair threat. The watchtower watchmen along the coasts of Spain and Italy kept their posts for years afterward, scanning the horizon by habit. It took a long time for communities to believe that the ships were not coming back. But the Corvette itself did not disappear. It just changed employers. The year is 1840 and a British Corvette is sailing east through the Mediterranean. It is escorting a merchant convoy. The same ship that had been the terror of merchant fleets for 2 centuries had become their protector. The transformation was not sudden, and it was not complete all at once. But by the middle of the 19th century, the Corvette's role in naval warfare had shifted in ways that its earlier captains would have found genuinely strange. The technology of the era forced part of the change. Steam power was arriving on naval vessels slowly at first, then more decisively. Ships that could move independently of the wind were fundamentally different tactical instruments. The pure speed advantage of the sailing Corvette, its ability to chase on any point of wind and to use weather as a weapon, diminished in a world where an opponent's engine could compensate for unfavourable conditions. But the hull form survived. The logic of a fast, manoeuvrable, relatively lightly armed vessel that could operate in coastal waters and provide escort or patrol functions did not disappear just because the threat it was designed around had changed. European navies, having fought the Corsair Corvette for 2 centuries, understood its capabilities better than almost anyone. They had studied it, chased it, occasionally captured it, and sometimes lost to it. When they decided they needed their own fleet of fast small warships for coastal patrol, escort duty, and anti-piracy operations in increasingly far-flung colonial waters, the Corvette was the logical foundation. The transition was both architectural and conceptual. Navies took the hull design, the proportions and the shallow draft that had made the Corsair Corvette dangerous, and adapted it to disciplined, institutionalized naval service, standardized armament, trained crews under formal naval discipline, clear chains of command that the old privateer Corvette had often lacked. The result was a vessel that served the British, French, Spanish, and Dutch navies for the rest of the 19th century, in roles that would have been familiar to the old Corsair captains, even if the specific operations were different. Escorting convoys instead of raiding them, suppressing slave trade operations along the West African coast, patrolling colonial trade routes, chasing down the pirates and smugglers who had replaced the Corsairs as the primary threat to merchant shipping. Some of those pirates were sailing modified Corvette hulls themselves. The pursuit continued, just with the names on the chasing ships' papers changed. The admirals who looked at a 19th century naval Corvette could see, in its lines and its draft and its proportions, the ghost of the ship that had terrified their predecessors. They had taken the Predator and trained it, given it a uniform and a flag. Underneath, the hull was the same, and on the seafloor of several oceans the physical evidence of what that hull had been through was only beginning to be found. The diver moved slowly over the bottom, 60 feet below the surface, somewhere off the southern coast of France. The light filters down in pale green columns through clear Mediterranean water. And then the shape appears, ribs of wood rising from the sand like the fingers of a buried hand, an anchor chain, green with growth, a row of iron cannon lying where they fell when the ship went down, probably in a matter of minutes, in a storm nobody recorded. Underwater archaeology has pulled the Corvette out of historical abstraction and turned it back into a physical object. The ships that sank in battles, in storms, on uncharted reefs, and in harbours that were later abandoned didn't disappear. They settled onto the seafloor and the ocean began preserving them. Wood that would have rotted in the air survives for centuries underwater when the conditions are right. Lack of oxygen, cold temperature, and low currents create environments where organic material slows its decomposition dramatically. The seafloor of the Mediterranean, the Atlantic, and the Caribbean holds wooden ships from the age of the Corvette in states of preservation that range from remarkable to almost intact. What archaeologists have found in those sites builds a picture of the Corvette from the inside out. The cannon are usually the first things visible, because iron survives submersion well even if it becomes encrusted with marine growth. Measure the cannon and you can calculate the ship's armament. Look at where they lie, and you can sometimes reconstruct whether the ship sank from a breach in the hull, which would have left the cannon in place on a deck that settled intact, or capsized, which would have scattered them. Below the cannon, if the site is well preserved, the hull itself. Shipbuilders of the Corvette era used specific construction techniques that archaeologists now recognize and can date. The spacing of the ribs, the type of wood, oak for the frame, pine for planking in many cases, the copper fasteners that held the planks together, introduced in the late 1700s to prevent the worm damage that ate through iron fasteners. These details place a wreck in time and sometimes in geographic origin. Personal objects are the details that make the archaeology human. Shoe buckles, clay pipe stems, broken at the same point because sailors held them by the bowl when the stem got too short. Ceramic bottles, a wooden button carved from bone, the small objects that inhabited a sailor's life and settled to the seafloor with him when the ship went down. One site off the coast of Tunisia produced something that took researchers years to fully understand. A set of navigational instruments, partially intact, including the brass arm of what appears to have been an early octant, the predecessor to the sextant, folded into its wooden case and resting where the captain's cabin once was. The case had survived because the wood was dense and the burial conditions were nearly perfect. The instrument inside still moved. That object, 300 years old and recovered from 60 feet of Mediterranean water, connected a researcher in a wetsuit to a captain who stood on a quarterdeck and looked at the stars and calculated where he was in the world. And in the museums and archives where those objects now rest, the larger question of what that captain meant to history was still being worked out. Walk along a modern naval pier in any significant maritime nation and look at the smaller vessels. There is a ship you will see in one form or another on almost every pier, between 200 and 400 feet long, fast, maneuverable, built for coastal patrol, escort operations and anti-submarine work in littoral zones, which is the naval term for shallow coastal waters, armed with missiles and a deck gun, crewed by a relatively small team of highly trained sailors. The navies of the world call this ship a Corvette. The name did not survive by accident. Naval architects and naval historians who trace the lineage of modern patrol combatants back through the 19th and 20th centuries find the same basic logic operating at every generation. A naval force needs a ship that is fast and maneuverable in coastal waters, a ship that can be built and operated in larger numbers than a destroyer or a frigate, a ship whose draft is shallow enough to operate in areas where larger vessels cannot go, a ship that multiplies a small crew's effectiveness through speed and sensor technology rather than through sheer weight of armament. This is exactly the logic that produced the original Corvette in the shipyards of 17th century France and the Barbary ports of North Africa. Modern corvettes carry weapons that their historical predecessors would find incomprehensible. Surface-to-air missiles, torpedoes, anti-ship missiles with ranges measured in hundreds of miles, radar and sonar systems that can detect a submarine or a low-flying aircraft from distances the old captains could not have imagined. The technology has changed in ways that make the ships nearly unrecognizable as physical objects. but put a 17th century Corvette captain on the bridge of a modern patrol combatant and walk him through the mission brief, and he would understand the assignment immediately. Fast ship, shallow water, find the threat before it finds you, use speed and surprise, protect the trade routes. The strategic logic is identical. It has been identical for 400 years, because the geography of coastlines and the economics of maritime trade have not changed in ways that invalidate it. Goods still move by sea. Coastlines still have shallow water that large ships cannot navigate. Speed still creates tactical options that slower vessels do not have. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps uses Corvette-sized fast attack craft in the Persian Gulf to threaten supertankers. The Swedish Navy operates corvettes in the Baltic specifically because that sea is too shallow for larger warships in many critical areas. The navies of Vietnam, Indonesia, and dozens of other nations have built their surface combat capability around the corvette because it fits their geography and their budget, the same way it fit the geography and budget of a corsair captain in 1670. The ship that Jean Bart sailed in the North Sea and that the captains of Algiers sent raiding along the coasts of Spain is still on patrol. It looks different. It moves by different power. Its weapons are beyond anything the old captains could have imagined. But its bones are the same. The statue of Jean Bart stands in the main square of Dunkirk. He's depicted in a heroic pose, sword raised, looking out toward the sea. The base of the statue lists his victories in proud detail. He's Dunkirk's most famous son, celebrated with a kind of permanent civic affection that most cities reserve for founders and saints. The man the statue represents was real. His victories were real. But the distance between the historical Jean Bart and the legendary Jean Bart had been growing since before he was cold in his grave, and the gap is worth examining because it says something about how these stories always work. The legend is clean. Jean Bart, the fisherman's son, rising by pure courage and skill to defeat the enemies of France, beloved by his crew, feared by his enemies, ennobled by his king. The legend is satisfying because it follows the shape of stories that human beings have always preferred. Humble origins, exceptional talent, just recognition, a life that proves merit matters. The historical record is more complicated, as it always is. Jean Bart did rise from poverty to nobility through skill and achievement. That part is confirmed. His tactical record across 30 years of operations in the North Sea is genuinely remarkable, and the historians who have studied it in detail, working through the naval records of the French Admiralty and the accounts of his opponents, describe a commander who was exceptional by the standards of his era. But he was also a man of his time. He operated in a system built on violence and coercion. The merchant ships he took were not abstract prizes. They were the livelihoods of specific families. The crews he captured were people with children and debts and plans that got interrupted. He understood this clearly, the way a professional in any dangerous trade understands the human cost of what he does, and he continued anyway. The Barbary captains went through a similar process of legend-making, though from the other side. European accounts of the Corsair commanders often swung between two equally distorted images: the cruel monster who burned villages and enslaved innocents, or, in a romantic tradition that developed later, the noble outlaw fighting a European colonial system that was doing the same things by different names. Both images simplified real men whose actual motivations were professional, financial, cultural, and personal in the same messy proportions as everyone else. What the historical picture shows is a population of skilled, ambitious, often ruthless men who operated in a world where the legal and ethical frameworks that constrain violence were genuinely different from modern ones, and who made choices that produced enormous suffering alongside the adventures that made them famous. The legends survive because the adventures make good stories. They always will. But the full picture, the suffering alongside the daring is the one worth holding on to, because the era those men defined was almost over. The year is 1805 and the world is at war in a way it has not been for generations. Napoleon Bonaparte has reorganized France into a military machine that controls most of continental Europe. Britain, its navy the finest in the world, is the last major power still fighting him from a position of genuine strength. And across the Atlantic, the Caribbean, the Mediterranean, and the North Sea, the two powers are fighting a naval war that is running simultaneously with the land campaigns and is in some ways more decisive. This is the Napoleonic Wars, and it is the last great flowering of the sailing corvette as a serious instrument of naval power. Both the British and the French deployed corvettes in enormous numbers during this period. The British used them primarily for commerce protection and intelligence work. Fast ships that could escort convoys in waters where a full frigate was not available, that could carry dispatches between fleet commanders, and that could patrol coastlines too shallow for larger vessels. The French used them for commerce raiding against British merchant shipping, a campaign that caused significant economic pain to British trade, even as the larger fleet engagements consistently favoured the British. The captains who commanded corvettes during this period were operating with the same basic logic that Jean Bart had used a century earlier: speed, surprise, knowledge of local waters, the willingness to take calculated risks that a frigate captain, responsible for a much more valuable asset, might decline. What was different was scale. The Napoleonic naval war involved hundreds of corvettes on both sides, operating across literally every ocean on the planet. British corvettes were patrolling the coast of West Africa for French privateers, while simultaneously a French corvette was raiding British merchant shipping near the coast of India, and another was causing disruption in the waters around Jamaica. The global reach of this final era of sailing corvette warfare was something that the original designers of the vessel, the shipbuilders working in French yards in the mid-1600s, could never have imagined. Their ship had grown from a regional instrument of coastal raiding into a global one. Individual corvette captains of the Napoleonic period built reputations that echoed the names of the earlier era. The French captain Robert Surcouf became famous for his operations in the Indian Ocean, taking British merchant vessels with a combination of audacity and tactical precision that drew comparison to Jean Bart himself. He was called the King of Corsairs in his own lifetime, which tells you something about how the tradition was understood by the people living inside it. The Battle of Trafalgar in 1805 settled the large fleet question firmly in Britain's favour. French naval power at the fleet level was effectively broken. But the Corvette War went on, because you do not need a great fleet to raid. You need one fast ship and a captain who knows what to do with it. The last generation of sailing corvette captains were men who understood they were sailing into an ending. Steam was coming. The age that had made them possible was closing. They sailed anyway. It is a Tuesday morning somewhere off the coast of Portugal, and the sea is the same sea it has always been. The same cold green Atlantic. The same horizon that curves away in every direction. The same light that comes slanting off the water in the early morning and turns everything it touches gold for exactly the few minutes before the sun gets high enough to bleach it out. The ships are different now. Steel hulls and diesel engines and radar masts. But the water is the same water, and the questions it asks have not changed since the first person looked at it and thought about crossing it. Who controls the sea? The Corvette was one answer to that question, and it turned out to be an answer with remarkable staying power. For 400 years, across every ocean on the planet, in the hands of fishermen's sons and Barbary captains and French privateers and colonial navies, the same basic formula kept producing results. Small, fast, shallow draft, enough weapons to threaten anything it could catch, a captain who knew his ship and his sea better than anyone trying to stop him. The formula worked because it matched a permanent truth about maritime power. The person who controls the coastline and the shallow water and the trade routes through them does not need the biggest ship. They need the right ship. Speed and knowledge of local conditions have always been worth more than raw firepower, in any era, in any technology. The Corsair captains of Algiers understood this so well that they built an entire economy around it and ran that economy for 2 centuries against the most powerful navies in Europe. They were eventually defeated, but it took a land invasion, not a naval one, to do it. The sea itself was never fully taken from them. Jean Bart understood it, and turned that understanding into a career so effective that a fisherman's son ended up with a statue in a public square that stands there still, looking out at the North Sea he never stopped studying. The women who moved through this world, the captives who wrote those letters, the communities that built watchtowers and learned the smoke signal code, the ransom negotiators and the priests and the families who sold everything they had to bring someone home, all of them understood something that the Corvette made impossible to ignore. The sea connects everything. It does not separate people. It puts them within reach of each other, which is both the source of everything good that trade and contact between cultures produces, and the source of the fear that coastal communities lived with for 3 centuries. That tension has not resolved. It has just changed form. The pirates operating in modern shipping lanes off the coast of Somalia use fast, small, maneuverable boats. Their tactics would be immediately recognizable to a captain out of Algiers in 1670. The navies deployed to stop them use Corvette-class vessels that carry the bones of the same ship that raided those coastlines 400 years ago. The question of who controls the sea is still being answered every day in waters around the world, and the answer still comes, in part, from a small, fast ship that knows the shallow water better than anyone trying to follow it. The Corvette is still hunting. Sleep well.